For roughly 120 USD, there's quite a lot to choose from in the case department. A Lian Li PC-11 Dynamic, case that I really love, the NZXT S340 Elite, the Coolmaster H500, it's a crowded field. Perhaps the case most similar to the Silent Base 601 from Be Quiet that I'm showing right here is the Fractal Design Define R6. I won't actively compare it in this review, but I do want you to keep it in the back of your mind because it's another case that's very similarly priced, actually similar in terms of its dimensions, but that offers a very different set of features. You can watch this video right here for a refresher. Both cases again take vastly different approaches in both form and function, and with one big exception, the Silent Base 601 actually nails it. The name suggests a silent profile. I mean, it's literally in the name of the case. So much of my review will revolve around this claim. The 601 is an elongated mid-tower with 7 PCIe slots, 2 vertical slots for optional mounting, and support for an array of hard drives toward the front. This model is black and orange, so you can buy this in black and gray or black with black trim. So you'll find the orange trim over the front intake in this case of the grills as well as the rubber grommets. I love seeing subtle differences in color options, and again, if you aren't a fan of orange, you can buy the gray or black trim models. Starting with overall stance and support, the 601 fits all the way up to eATX motherboards if you're willing to remove these drive covers. There is no indentation toward the front, as with some other cases for extra cable management headroom, but you aren't likely to miss it anyway, seeing as though the entire right side of this case protrudes an entire 3 or so centimeters, actually about an inch and maybe a quarter behind the motherboard tray. That means that you'll have extra space back here for remaining cables, hard drives, and anything else you want to really fit back on the right side. So under almost any circumstance I can imagine, securing the right panel is pretty easy. Speaking of which, how does that work? So the Silent Base 601 deploys a pair of trigger release buttons toward the back that unlatch both the right and left panels in identical fashion. This is a very simple solution, similar in design to the NZXT H700i's right panel latch, and it works very well in this case. And another thing, at least in my case, no pun intended, pushing the button doesn't mean that the panel falls over and slams onto your desk. It's actually held firmly in place until intentionally removed from the grooves at the base of the chassis, so no unwanted destruction there. So great construction and implementation. I actually think that this might be slightly over-engineered, although it is beautifully constructed. I'm not trying to stereotype German design, but it could probably be a little simpler. I'm not gonna complain though, because it works really well as is. But speaking of these panels, you can see how beefy they are. There's like little ventilation slits up top, although they don't look very functional. You can see that the glass itself is actually slightly tinted. I'm happy about it. You'll actually be able to see inside your case if you choose the window version of the 601, which means that you're not gonna have to light it up with LEDs if you really wanna see through a dark tint in any other case. Again, no, it's a really thick panel. It's not necessary, especially this stuff up top, but it's very sturdy, and I mean that kind of fits into the price tag, right? You're really paying for quality, and this reliable construction here, I really like the way it looks. The right panel has no glass, but instead sports a super thick damping mat at 10 millimeters. It's actually one of the thickest I've ever seen in a case, and extends to both the top and front of the case as well. If you opt for the non-windowed version, you'll also have this mat on the left side. So this plays a huge part in keeping things quiet inside, and when paired with the right mix of hardware, results in a super stealthy profile overall. Hearing anything from inside this case would be a major pain, because you'd have to really try hard to hear anything. I'm serious, even with the glass panel version that I have here, it's a very silent case, even when things are under full load. I'm not talking about this specific build here, obviously this is set up for water cooling, but any build that you have in here, even when you run fans at full RPM, which we'll talk about later, it's an overall very silent case. And that's again what you're paying for, right? Silence in the name, you expect it to be silent, and I was blown away by just how suppressed everything was from a noise standpoint in this case. Now, an important point to keep in mind though about the non-windowed version is that it will be quieter with that extra mat on the left panel. Tempered glass is pretty terrible in general at sound damping, so if you're into buying a Silent Base 601 for its low audio profile, make sure you forego the tempered glass version. The top of the case is pretty bare, save this removable radiator and fan bracket. It doesn't require any screws to remove, which is actually really nice, and it spans the entire top section of the case for a full triple fan support, though you may want to shy away from using this altogether, and we'll talk about why later in the video. So the back of the case is pretty standard. A removable PSU bracket supports the rear PSU mounting that we've seen on many cases to date, though this one is a very tight fit with certain power supplies, including the one I have in here from Enermax. A large dust filter spans the entire base of the case, by the way, and can be removed from the front if you're worried about cleaning anything that your power supply might pull through it. Vertical graphics card mounting is supported, like I said earlier, but it places the card right against the glass. So if you don't plan on water cooling, I'd stay away from this for now. Maybe include like a third-party vertical kit that can be, used as a replacement for the horizontal brackets, but this thing back here is no good for air-cooled cards in my opinion. And I mean, to be honest, it's not like you get a riser cable or bracket anyway with the purchase of the case. Now, I really love the basement inclusion in 601. I'm glad that Be Quiet has actually caught on to the basement craze. It was something that we saw in the Dark Base 700, and I really like the aesthetic, what they've done here by kind of indenting the Be Quiet logo on the bottom. It's very subtle, but you know it's a Be Quiet case when you see it, not only because of the orange accents, but because, again, of this logo, which isn't going to stand out from a crowd. But if you're really looking for it, trying to figure out who designs the case, then there you go. It's actually one of only 2, I think, locations where you'll find the name of the company manufacturing the case is here on the side of the power supply and up front. Now the basement is slightly modular, referring to the 2 removable pieces toward the front. One provides access for a 360mm radiator or something similar. That's a change from the original Silent Base 600, of which this case is kind of like the, I guess, younger brother. And the other acts as an optional fan mount for added ventilation from below if you're really into that sort of thing, though I'm sure you could probably turn this into a makeshift pump res mount or something like that with a few added little tweaks to it. With respect to custom water cooling though, there appears to be ample room. I'll actually be throwing a custom loop build into this case soon, which is why you're seeing all these custom loop gear in here, minus the tubing and the reservoir and the pump. So I'll be able to speak more to that application in the future, but for now, it looks like there's ample room. There's plenty of space between the motherboard, the edge of an ATX motherboard, and where the radiator sits currently, and that's where originally all the hard drive trays would go. So you are foregoing that aspect of the case when you choose to throw a custom loop in here. Though, I mean, most people I know aren't filling their cases with tons of hard drives, so it's a nice addition for those who really need it, but the modularity of this case keeps it at bay. If you aren't interested in filling it with hard drives, you can turn this into a very water cooling friendly case. I'm almost certain of it, just seeing from the stuff that I've thrown in here how easy it is to arrange it all. I was a little disappointed though that the front radiator cutout is about 5mm too short for a 60mm thick rad. So if you got a really beefy rad, it's not going to fit in this case because that indentation actually narrows into that next removable panel, and that makes it too narrow for a standard form factor radiator. So you're only going to fit up to maybe 40mm thick rads in here. 60s again are not going to fit just by a hair or two. I wish they would have made it just a little larger, and then putting a beefy rad up front would really that would have been awesome. I actually had one I wanted to use, couldn't use it because, again, that small difference between the size of the cutout and the thickness of the rad. Now I touched on this earlier, but I want to quickly dig into the right side of the case. With the 3 or so centimeters, you won't have trouble routing cables or even using extensions. Tie points litter the tray, and Be Quiet includes Velcro straps in the box to keep things nice and clean. You can mount up to 2 hard drives by default toward the front. The entire cage is removable, and the orange rubber vibration mounts are a welcomed addition. As the case is very long from front to back, you'll find more than enough room for a really thick power supply. Even with the large extended ones, you can find plenty of space for remaining cables and extra things like extensions, or you can like tape SSDs down here if you really want. Case in point, there's a lot of space at the bottom because the case is so long, or depth-wise thick. What's the dimension I'm looking for? Anyway, it's longer than normal. A removable SSD tray sits behind the motherboard tray and serves as an excellent use of otherwise wasted space. This is not new by any means. It's what we've seen quite a bit from Fractal Design cases in the past, but I really like the inclusion. I don't mind copying at all. I don't think Fractal Design came up with the idea, but it works really well in this case because otherwise you're gonna have to mount SSDs into the hard drive trays below, and if you have 2 hard drives already, you're gonna have to add something up top or tape it to somewhere else in the case. So having that extra little bracket there behind the motherboard is actually a really nice inclusion, given all the other support this case already has. But at this point, I have to point out the one huge compromise with this case. If you can't already tell, that's airflow. So the entire chassis is actually closed off, and that's part of the reason why it's so quiet, not only thanks to the sound damping mats, but also because it is literally a shell that has very few access points to the atmosphere. I mean, the reason why I told you to avoid the top fan, rad bracket, whatever you want to call it earlier, is because the potential for airflow either in or out of the case up here is super limited. So just looking up into the case now, you see the sound damping pad. It spans the entire top section, the whole ceiling, if you will, of this case. There are a few tiny slits back here at the rear. These will work kind of, but only for the rear fan. So if you place, let's say, 2 fans, one here and one toward the front, this one over here is either gonna be pushing air into a sound damping pad, which does nothing. It's gonna make your system sound louder, and that's about it. Or it's gonna try to pull air from a sound damping pad, at which point, why do you even have the fan there to begin with? So I like this. I like the bracket itself, but I think that the design choice, especially given how restrictive airflow is with the top section of this case, is just a little confusing to me, because this would have worked great if they had like a mesh top panel or something that had just a little more breathing room, but this is entirely closed off, again, attributed to the silent factor of the case, but then it hinders airflow, and then if your system gets louder because components are running hotter, then it's not as silent anymore, and doesn't that defeat the purpose? Like, the front panel is arguably worse from this perspective. The tiny metal holes up front are already restrictive enough, but the air must then turn, get this, 90 degrees inward, and then 90 degrees back toward the case's rear, at which point it passes through a dust filter that's more resistance before hitting the fan blades, assuming you have a couple fans up front. This creates a strong negative pressure zone between the front panel and chassis, as exhibited here. I tied a few thin strips of paper to one of the included PureWings 2 fans, there are 2 by the way included with this case, and mapped airflow patterns with the front panel off versus on. What you're seeing here is the fan operating at max RPM with the panel on. This is what it looks like with the front panel off. I'll pivot back and forth a few times just so you can see. There's a huge difference here, and it's something to strongly consider when buying this case, and that's ultimately where I struggle with the entire point of this chassis. Like, I think it looks really good, I love the silent aspect of it, but it's really limiting itself in terms of who would buy this, because for overclocking enthusiasts or just people who have, you know, hot components, say you have an R9 390 or 290 or 290X, you know that thing's gonna run really hot, right? So you want as optimal airflow as possible. You're not gonna get that from the front. You're not gonna get that from the top. You're not gonna get that from the left side panel unless you turn this thing to an intake, at which point, I mean, even then, I'm gonna question how you're gonna get the air out of your case, because it's just so closed off in here. You're not gonna have a good time with those, you know, toasty components. So overclockers definitely want to be weary of this one. So I get that this is supposed to be silent, and it certainly is, but only up to a certain point, right? Where temperatures inside heat up hardware past a certain point, then those fan curves need to be ramped up, meaning the entire build would effectively operate louder as a result, making this build not silent anymore, right? So from an overclocking enthusiast perspective, in my opinion, this is a no-go. Plain and simple, the system's just gonna get way too hot, you're gonna be starved for air, and it's gonna run pretty loud. The top panel actually inhibits natural radiation upward, by the way, because there's minimal ventilation up top. So it's just, I'm just questioning why they didn't put some kind of mesh material up here. I know they wanted to keep it quiet, but it's really hard to go for a very silent-oriented chassis without compromising on airflow capabilities, because in order to have airflow maximized, you have to have kind of like a very thin membrane, right, between the interior of the chassis and the atmosphere. That means that any component inside your system running pretty loud will be heard by people around the case, and then it's no longer silent. So they definitely are trade-offs, but at what point do you end up sacrificing so much airflow that your system becomes so much hotter as a result that it's just as loud as it would have been before? And that's what I'm struggling with this case. I'm not sure yet, I have to run more tests, but for now, I can say for certain that this front panel is extremely restrictive when it comes to airflow, and that the top certainly doesn't help anything. By the way, I did include an extra SilentWings 3 fan with this build. The 2 fans that you get included with the case are PureWings 2 fans, and they're still pretty good, but these stay really silent. So that's why I threw one in here. It's gonna probably have to work overtime to get whatever heat is in here out of the system. So that's why I threw it back there. I moved the 2 Pure Wings 2 fans up front, and that's what I recommend you do as well. You're gonna wanna pull as much air as you possibly can through this restrictive front panel. So my conclusion for this case is this. If you're running a low profile setup, don't plan on overclocking, maybe have relatively quiet hardware, maybe be quiet or Noctua fans, coolers, and a large graphics card with plenty of cooling potential, then you're fine. Your system will run several degrees hotter depending on your configuration over that of like an airflow optimized case, but you'll still be able to keep the noise level down under load at the expense of slightly higher thermals. Now, if you're overclocking, running an R9 290X, let's say, sticking with the two chassis fan default setup, whatever, overclock your CPU to 5 gigahertz, then things will get hot, loud, and at that point, I would question the viability of buying a silent case to begin with anyway. So it really depends on who's in the market for what. I can certainly see a use case for this case, but it isn't for everyone. We'll see how well a custom loop holds up in it in the coming weeks. If you guys like this video, thumbs up, you know what to do. Thumbs down for the opposite. Let me know what you think about the case in the comment section below, and I'll catch you in the next video. This is Science Studio. Thanks for learning with us.